WashingTECH.
I remember doing focus groups with parents years and years ago when we still had flip phones that weren't smart, and saying to them, it's going to be really difficult when kids have these devices and they're accessing the internet on their mobile devices. And the parents said, don't be so ridiculous. Why on earth would a child want a phone? And, here we are 20 years later when, every child in the world is keen to get their hands on their first mobile phone as early as possible.
Welcome to Tech Policy.
From Washington, D.C., this is Tech Policy
with Joe Miller.
Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
My guests today are Vicki Shotbolt, who's the founder and CEO of Parent Zone, which keeps families informed and works with partners on digital literacy issues. She's worked with global brands, including Microsoft and Vodafone, to make Britain more family-friendly. Geraldine Bedell is executive editor of Parent Zone, and prior to joining Parent Zone, Geraldine worked for 10 years as a writer at The Observer in Britain. Before that, she was a columnist and writer for The Independent, and she's written for most national newspapers in a wide range of magazines in the UK. She's also produced and presented documentaries for Radio 4. Vicki Shotbolt and Geraldine Bedell. Vicki and Geraldine, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You are the founders of Tech Shock, which is a fantastic podcast that I was on, and based in London. Why don't we get started talking about your work a bit and get some background on some of the great stuff you've been doing.
Oh, I think it's 18 years, 2004. I set up Parent Zone, and Geraldine and I have been working on and off on various collaborations throughout that time. What we set out to do is to help families navigate all of the complexity of digital family life. Tech Shock, the podcast, is very much Geraldine's baby. I just tag along and ask questions that she very carefully curates for me. Is that right, Geraldine?
Not entirely right. No, we couldn't manage without your expertise, Vicki. But yes, Tech Shock is a podcast that's grown out of our work at Parent Zone. We work with parents and teachers and other professionals who work with children. We work with grant makers. We work with tech companies. We work with everyone who's interested in the future of families online. And there are lots of big issues swirling around that, I guess. And so we thought that it would be good to have a podcast where we could showcase some of those issues and we could really address some of the kind of knottier questions that arise out of families online.
So I'd love to zero in on online safety in Europe, something folks in the US are trying to learn more about because it's having such an impact on the way we do business here. So I thought it would be helpful for you to come in and share your ideas on what's happening there, what parents need to know about, what caregivers need to know about, and what teachers need to know about. What are you seeing? How is it affecting consumers worldwide in your view?
Gosh, there's an enormous amount in that question. I guess the first thing
there is a lot. Where should we start? There is a lot because we have all of these regulations now, and folks are confused. So let's at least try to zero in and clarify what's happening in the UK and in Europe. I don't know if you want to talk about both because of Brexit, so that adds an additional layer of complexity. So why don't we start there? Let's talk about the differences between Europe writ large and what's happening in the UK.
I will have a bash at what's happening in the UK, and Geraldine can add in more detail, I'm sure. But I think the fundamental thing that's happening in the UK is that we've got an online safety bill that's making its way through Parliament, and that online safety bill will be our attempt to regulate the internet, thinking very much about social media and user-generated content, plus some other bits and bobs. We've brought age verification on pornography into the bill. There are still debates about whether or not financial scams will be included in the bill, but fundamentally it's about user-generated content on social media, and the politicians would say it's about making the UK the safest place in the world to go online. It's very different, I think, to what's happening in Europe, and I think that's one of the interesting things from our perspective about the internet, and that it does feel as though different parts of the world are tackling this question in different ways. the Digital Services Economy Act, I think I've got that right, is really focused much more on privacy, I would say, and on data, and starting to try and tackle some of the power of the big tech companies in a slightly different way. So I would say it's very complementary legislation, but it's different to what we're doing in the UK, which is much more to user level. Have I covered that, Geraldine? I'm sure I've missed enormous bits that are critical.
No, I think that's a very succinct summary of what's going on. The Online Safety Bill has been presented in Parliament. It's about to be debated. I'm sure there'll be lots of pushback. There'll be lots of argument about free speech in particular. And we'll have to see what we end up with. But it is an attempt really to impose a duty of care on, certainly on the bigger tech companies. It's a very, very complex piece of legislation, which nobody really can get their head around, even the lawyers. But it's an attempt to impose a duty of care on tech companies who will have to set out what they're doing, particularly to protect children, and then will have to show how they're meeting those conditions that they've laid down for themselves, and they will be subject to fines, heavy fines, if they don't do that. We'll have to see how it pans out. It feels like we're kind of groping in the dark at the moment, because this sort of thing has never been tried before, and as you know, the internet has been incredibly resistant to kind of state control or state mediation, and this is not meant to be state control, obviously. But it will be interesting to see what happens, and it'll be interesting to see what effect it has internationally, as you suggest. I mean, I don't really understand to what extent this will kind of lead the charge on making the internet companies, the tech companies, more responsible, in inverted commas. I think that's the hope, but it's quite likely that there will be different kinds of access in different jurisdictions, and the tech companies will adapt to that.
Yeah, there are a tremendous number of moving parts, not to mention what's happening in Asia. It's a lot to keep track of for policymakers, and as, like me, founders of your own platform, we also have to figure out, as marketers to some extent, what are the things that we're going to need to do in order to be compliant. So, I mean, we've never collected cookies or anything like that. We just look at, what folks are searching for, so we can develop and write content that's more responsive to that. Are there any provisions that you're aware of in anything that's happening that would apply to specifically to small businesses, or any discussion around what the effects would be of what's currently pending?
It's a really interesting question. One of the things that I know some people are concerned about is that there are estimates that around 24,000 companies will be brought within scope of this bill, which is in stark contrast to the kind of narrative that is being presented by policymakers. And I think the intention, which is to really focus on those bigger tier one, what have been called tier one companies, which are the larger social media platforms. But one of the concerns is that this will trickle down to place additional requirements on small companies. How that will pan out in effect, and that is, as Geraldine said, one of the real difficulties with this bill. It's so complex, and there are so many things that are still to be defined, that the answer is nobody knows, but I suspect more than's been presented at the moment.
What was it? It's part of your story, part of your journey in this space. What was kind of the lightning bolt that got you involved in this work?
I feel as though people are always disappointed when I answer this question, because I'm not really a lightning bolt kind of girl. There wasn't a moment when I went, oh my goodness, the world really needs Parent Zone. It was much more that I had spent most of my career working with children and young people, and then working in parenting, and had developed a real interest in and understanding of how important it is to help parents do what is a very, very important job, which is raising the next generation. And we in the UK are spectacularly bad at doing that. We don't provide very much support to parents. We kind of say, go forth and figure it out. And, I've never thought that was really good enough. And if you add digital into that mix, I remember doing focus groups with parents years and years ago when we still had flip phones that weren't smart, and saying to them, it's going to be really difficult when kids have these devices and they're accessing the internet on their mobile devices. And the parents said, don't be so ridiculous. Why on earth would a child want a phone? And, here we are 20 years later when, every child in the world is keen to get their hands on their first mobile phone as early as possible. So you throw that into the mix, you throw a digital world that gives open access to anything and everything to parents, and it's really, really difficult and complicated. So it wasn't a lightning bolt moment. It was more it's important to support parents, and they're going to need more support than ever in a digital world.
Yeah, and I think if I can come in there, I think the lightning bolt moment for me, which was when I started working with Vicki, is that online safety isn't enough, that approaching the internet from a kind of online safety perspective shuts out all kinds of things, not least how much fun children have online and how much they love it. And so we work much more with a digital resilience model, and we're very, very interested in media literacy. I mean, it's not that we don't think there should be legislation. We do think there should be legislation, but that has to go alongside digital literacy, and we're working with the UK government on that. So we take a sort of nuanced view. I mean, we don't say for a moment that there aren't horrible things that can happen online, but that's not our starting point.
Policy is global policy. This is the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast, serving the world.
So when you discuss with parents what their concerns are regarding the internet, whether you're in casual conversation or whatever it is it something that folks are raising, or is it something that's sort of kind of a low grade awareness as opposed to being top of mind among the parents you talk to? Because here, I think folks talk generally about their kids being concerned about screen time, but it's not necessarily the main topic of conversation like it is when, we're talking about which soccer team the kids are going to be on, or which middle school or high school they're going to attend, or what the nuances are with the college application process. Are you seeing it as something that's more top of mind?
I don't know that I would categorize it as top of mind. Digital is part of family life, and it's so much a part of family life. It's a bit like asking kids about, when they go online and they look at you really blankly because they don't go online. It's just part of what they do. And I think it's kind of the same for families. They don't think, oh, I must think about digital now. They just have digital in their lives. And sometimes getting the balance right is difficult. And you're right, people do worry about screen time in the UK as much as they do elsewhere. But typically it's not like joining a soccer team. It's more those moments when you might think, is now the right time to buy my child a mobile phone? Or am I happy with how much screen time he's having? But it's not a subject in and of itself. It's just part and parcel of raising kids now.
And it is all consuming in that sense. I think it's quite interesting that attitudes have changed a bit since the pandemic. Screen time, as Vicki says, is still an issue, but I think parents are more accepting of the idea that it's actually what you're doing when you're on screen that really matters, and not how many hours you're sitting there.
That's interesting that you say that, because most of the platforms that Congress was investigating after, they looked at Facebook after Cambridge Analytica, they looked at everything after the scandal last year with the whistleblower at Facebook who released all of these documents saying what Facebook was planning to do and what they were doing with data. But they're not focusing, legislators and policymakers, they don't seem to be focusing on the platforms that kids spend the most time on. Discord wasn't at any of the hearings. Twitch wasn't at any of the hearings. And when we're talking about the metaverse, those are the platforms that are the future. So, and that's a lot of where a lot of these pedophiles and other bad actors have access through chats. And I just find it interesting that parents are more concerned about content, but it doesn't appear the legislators have necessarily picked up on that yet.
I think that is such a good point, because in the online safety bill that we've been talking about, gaming gets, I think it's one mention. It might be a mention and a half, but it's definitely not much of a mention. And actually, the truth is that it's in games that children spend the bulk of their times, and most children are gaming. I think we've done quite a bit of research on gaming for one reason or another, and that's where they are. So for policymakers not even to be acknowledging that is quite frightening. And I think some of the financial manipulation techniques that games use to get children spending are really insidious and really problematic, and are likely to be even worse if the metaverse is ever built, when it's built, which in my humble opinion, for what it's worth, I don't think it's going to be Meta that builds the metaverse. I think it's much more likely to be someone like EA Games. And all of those unscrupulous financial techniques that the gaming industry have perfected are going to be taken across into their version of the metaverse, I fear.
Yeah,
because all these communities are basically going to become, they're all going to have their own crypto, essentially.
Yeah, and we're extremely concerned about the overlap between gaming and gambling, and we've done quite a lot of work on that. And I think that is one of the problems that legislation faces, that functionalities are changing all the time. And we're extremely concerned as well about live streaming, which allows for all kinds of interactions that aren't even recorded, and there's no proof afterwards of what happened very often. So it's very difficult, I think, I think that's partly why it's taken the UK government so long to come up with this bill, because they they genuinely want to try and kind of have a portmanteau that everything will fit into. But it's really, really difficult in a situation where functionalities are changing all the time.
What are some additional open questions that you think should be addressed?
I think one of the open questions about certainly the UK legislation is how well it's going to deal with hate speech. And I know that's very much your kind of area of interest. And I think there's an enormous amount of weight being put on it and hope for it from women, from people of colour, all sorts of minorities. And I think that's where the real political contest is going to come, because that's where the free speech lobby, misnomer in my view, because they don't account for the freedom to be free from hate speech. But that's where the free speech lobby is going to fight, I think. And I suspect that we're not going to get nearly as far as people hope with that.
Yeah, the U.S. Supreme Court won't even recognize a standard for hate speech. I mean, they've acknowledged that it exists, but they won't define, what exactly it is. And you have all of these free speech advocates saying that viewpoint diversity is more important than worrying about hate speech. But a lot of folks don't have access to the platforms that these folks are using to establish these channels, and so their voices aren't being heard. So folks in public housing, folks in rural areas, and those counter narratives are left out. And so the notion that viewpoint diversity somehow excludes some component that includes racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in its definition is just, it's silly. It's smoke and mirrors to suggest that somehow viewpoint diversity is different from, having a multiplicity of racial, ethnic, and gender diverse voices contributing content online.
Yeah, and even without the question of access, there's the question of how racial and ethnic and gender minorities are treated online, and the barriers against actually speaking up. They're enormous.
Absolutely.
And we have a similar problem in the UK with definition. I mean, we have this thing in the bill, legal but harmful, but nobody is quite clear on how that's going to be defined, and hate speech very much falls into that category. But picking up on your question about privacy, I think it's a fascinating question, particularly in the context of schools. We did a podcast with Carissa Valise, I don't know if you remember, Geraldine, and it was about data, basically, and how our data is used and tracked. And I think for parents, it's a very, I don't know whether it is currently front of mind. I suspect it's not, but it's a terrifying prospect that their children's data is being shared and used and potentially will inform their future without any scrutiny, without any proper oversight from adults or even adequate consent. And I think that's a really worrying. I know I came away from the Carissa Valise podcast that we did feeling absolutely terrified about the future of our data.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the conversations that we're actually having in the UK bypass that completely.
Parents themselves, like you said, Vicki, are stretched too thin and not even able to implement and enforce their own rules. And I think some of these platforms know to some extent. Some are more responsible than others, but I think they know that it's the Wild West when it comes to the metaverse now. These Discord and Twitch and all these platforms where kids are playing games and interacting in that universe, and so they're not subject to the same regulations or the same oversight as the bigger players, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, and so on. But I think that'll change eventually, because the same thing happened with Google. I remember when Google, Twitter, and Facebook didn't even have an office in DC. And I think the same thing's going to happen for a lot of these platforms. In any case, what are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
Shall I take that one? parentzone.org.uk is where you can find us online. And the podcast Tech Shock you can find on any podcast platform that you use. Final thought is optimism, I guess. And we always say that, there is a lot to be worried and concerned about, but the opportunity that technology gives to kids is the thing that we come back to. And that's what we're kind of all about, making sure that opportunity is available and that the difficult stuff doesn't get in the way of technology adding value to young people's lives.
Vicki Shotbolt and Geraldine Bedell of Parent Zone and co-founders of Tech Shock Podcasts. Geraldine and Vicki, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
WashingTECH.